In this video, we're going to simplify square roots of negative numbers. So we never want to leave something written as the square root of a negative number. What we want to do is factor out the imaginary part and rewrite it in terms of I. So recall that the square root of negative 1 equals I. You can think of I as a variable, but it's really just a definition. I is always the square root of negative 1. So on number 1, you could rewrite this as 3 times the square root of negative 1 times 16. The reason you can do that is because negative 1 times 16 is negative 16, so we haven't changed the problem at all. We've only factored out the negative 1. Using the radical rule, I could rewrite this as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 16. Well, you know what the square root of 16 is. It's just 4. So I could rewrite this as 4 times 3 times the square root of negative 1. 4 times 3 in the outside simplifies to 12. And let's think about the square root of negative 1. The point is we want to get rid of negative signs underneath the radical. We know that the square root of negative 1 is actually just I. So we would represent this solution as 12 times I, or 12I. On number 2, we can do the same thing. We can rewrite negative 75 by factoring out the negative 1. So I could write this as negative square root of negative 1 times 75, which turns into negative square root of negative 1 times the square root of 75. Now, we've separated out the square root of negative 1. Instead of leaving it like that, we're going to write that as I. So right now we have negative I times the square root of 75. And we're not quite done yet, because we can simplify the square root of 75 using the rules we've already learned about perfect squares. Perfect square that goes into 75 would be 25. So I can rewrite this as negative I times the square root of 25 times the square root of 3. And lastly, the square root of 25 simplifies to 5. So it's negative 5I times the square root of 3. Try simplifying number 3 on your own and see how you can do. Unpause the video when you're done. We're going to rewrite the square root of negative 12 as the square root of negative 1 times 12, which turns into I times the square root of 4 times 3, which turns into 2I times the square root of 3. On number 4, again, we want to try to factor out the negative 1 underneath the radical. So we're going to have 2 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 36. Square root of 36 is 6, and 6 times 2 is 12. So the final answer is 12I. Again, the square root of negative 36 can have a negative 1 under the radical factored out. So I could write this as 1/3 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 63. The square root of negative 1 is just I. So I have 1/3 I times the square root of 9 times the square root of 7. That's how you can factor 63 into a perfect square and a non-perfect square. The square root of 9 is 3, and 1/3 times 3 is 1. So you're left with just I times the square root of 7.